A lot of people might argue that creating car setups is super difficult. Well, it's super difficult if you try to explain everything at the same time. It is actually very easy if you follow a system and some real world examples. So let's just do that in this video. And the best thing about this video is we're going to create a GT3 car that is going to be flying on the straight and also very easy to handle. So if you're interested in that, stick around and watch how I built a car setup in Le Mans Ultimate for a GT3 car. And the best thing is this setup that I'm creating on Spa, I carry over to every other track. 20 minutes of driving already gives me a very solid baseline using this system. And if you are a beginner or advanced, doesn't really matter. If you're a beginner, it's going to be a very simple system to follow. And if you are super advanced, this is going to save you a hell of a lot of time in your car setup builds. Let's go. So if you want to create a setup that is really fast on the straights and is like a most lap time potential, especially when you have some straight lines in your track, you need to go to race weekend. You pick season 24, you pick Spa, this is crucial. In this example, we're gonna take the BMW. Now it's important that you are putting the tire warmers on the bottom right here, and you wanna have the weather settings always the same. For every time you're testing, you need to keep this the same so you can actually measure it, because the car will have different performances under different tire temperatures. So that's important. Also, for all these examples, I have starting grip light. Again, you want to make sure you always have the same grip level so you can actually measure it. What are the first changes you need to make to create a car that is fast on the straights? We go to car setup. Take the default setup and you want to remove the rear wing to the max, and you want to remove the rake of the car. Nothing more you're going to do. I would also go as far to say to remove the packers. More on that later. What are you searching for now? First, let me explain the model, why I'm saying you need to remove all the rear ride height and you need to remove all the rear wing. Ride height is very important when you're considering a low wing setup. With a high wing setup, you definitely need a different ride height, but with low wing, you also need something different. Let me explain the difference between a high wing and a low wing setup and how ride height needs to change accordingly. When you have a lot of pressure on the rear wing, you create a lot of understeer in fast corners. So you bring the ride height, the rear ride height up to bring the aero box forward to create a new rotating balance under high speed situations. When you remove the rear wing, however, we don't have any pressure on the rear tires anymore, and if we apply the same ride height with like a max wing setup, we get a very oversteery and dangerous car because all the aerodynamics is pulling towards the front tire. So we need to bring back the rear ride height to make the car completely flat with the lowest wing setting. How do we test if we can get away with the lowest wing setting? Well, when we remove all ride height, we're creating a situation that we're pushing the box, aerodynamic box, backwards as much as possible with the lowest wing. In the next test, I will show you if we can get our rouge right in the steps that I'm going to explain. Then we can safely assume that we can get away with the low wing setting. And it's very easy to find out. It only takes like 30 seconds. Let me show you. So you go out of the pit, and what you're going to do is immediately go full throttle. We have the tire warmers. We go out. We have no rake. We have no rear wing. And we need to attack El Rouge like this really properly. And if this happens, then it means you do not have enough pressure on the rear wing. So when you lost it, it is important to increase the rear wing. Why is this? Well, I will tell you why. Because we have the suspension, we have the lowest ride height, we have the max amount, like the lowest amount of packers. And if we cannot get the car safely through Eau Rouge, we just don't have enough pressure on the back. Now, in this example with the BMW, you can do this. Like I made the example for an extreme situation to explain, because like a McLaren or a Ferrari has a very hard time with the lowest wing setting. By the way, the lowest wing setting is different for every car. It's really good. Every car has its own aerodynamic model. So how does it look then when you have too much? So let's say you take an Air Rouge, but you understeering with the lowest rear wing. And when you have the ride height to the minimum and you have understeer. That's how this example is going to look. This is how the understeer looks like. So you pick the lowest wing, you have no rake, and the car just doesn't want to turn in Air Rouge and Radio, and you just have a lot of understeer. What you need to do now. If you have the understeer situation, you need to bring this box forward, and this is achieved by increasing the rear ride height. And that you're gonna find right here. You need to increase it. Now, how much? If you really feel a lot of understeer, you might bring it up. And if you are at the point that it gets dangerous, but you really need to be sensible with your steering input, you might trigger the right balance. And the right balance is gonna look like the next example. This is the balance you're searching for. Cut that first corner. Really take that radio corner and then have the proper balance. This is something you need to aim for with the ride heights. So this is the first step. Go out of the pit, make sure you can survive Air Rouge with the lowest wing setting, put the ride height accordingly to create rotation, and make sure, if you want to be extra safe about how the wing setting and the ride heights are properly, you need to take Blanchiment full throttle as well. If you want to go really deep in the steps that I take, I highly recommend you watch the other video that I made before on the high wing, high downforce setup, and that one I'll put in the description. And if you're liking this content this far, could you please hit that like button? That really helps me out. Thanks for doing that. And if you want a step file with the steps I'm taking and a little bit of a summary what I'm doing here, you want to subscribe to my free Patreon. I put a list there in the pinned comment, which you can follow whenever you want to build your low downforce, high top speed setups for GT3 cars in Le Mans Ultimate. So now we need to go to the second step, and we need to make sure we are surviving the Pouhon corner and the corner section that follows. And after this failsafe, we are going to create a situation where we also increase the speed of our car in these slow corners. So stay tuned for that. But first, let's create a failsafe in our low downforce setup, because it's kind of tricky to drive a low downforce setup. It's more for the higher level players, but it's absolutely crucial you start using a low downforce setup to be mega quick on the straights. The biggest and most important difference between a high and a low wing setup is obviously its top speed, but also the brake bias. Because if we run a high wing setup, we can get away with a lot lower brake bias. Why? Well, I will explain you why. When you're hitting the brakes fully on a high speed situation and you have a rear wing pushing the rear wheels, we can push some of its brake balance to the rear wheels to help slow the car down. And we can totally get away with that with a high wing setup because we have the pressure, right? So whenever you want to go for a low wing setup, a very safe assumption is to get a higher brake bias as a starting point. So how do we know when we are pushing the brake bias too low or too high? And in this next example on the Pouhon corner, it's a really great corner to figure out how low you can push the brake bias. So for everyone who doesn't really want to get into deep brake bias theory, just a small example. Lower brake bias means more lower brake bias on the front end. So we have 49% here on this image, and with the low wing setup, it's 55. Now you could say, yeah, man, I mean 6%, what's the difference? Well, the difference is huge. And I will show you in the next example how this difference how brake bias needs to change accordingly. So here's an example how it looks when you have too low of a brake bias. You can see the front is like biting into the corner, And if this feels really dangerous, then you just need to increase the brake bias and have more safety. Also for this corner, when you're braking, like I cannot control it because we have not enough pressure on the rear wing, and this is how we lose control. Now we need to increase the brake bias. So whenever you're building your car setups and you're doing these test runs with all these different parameters, it's important that you drive 85% of your limit, because then you can actually feel the changes. If you're pushing the car and you make setup changes, then you're really fast into every limit of your car setup and it's very hard to measure. I really like the 85% approach, because if you're creating a better setup change, you can start to feel that you can push the car. Like you feel like, okay, with the brake bias change, I can brake later. Or with the different ride height change, you can feel I can go on throttle earlier. And this is really important. So whenever you do the setup changes, drive a little bit below your limit. This way you can actually drive a consistent lap and feel the setup changes. Let's move on. You increased the brake bias a little bit. Let's say you went for 54 46. This is very high for BMW, by the way, guys. But just know that with other cars, especially the mid-engine or a Porsche, this gets really like, you're gonna notice these changes a lot more. Now, what if you have this brake bias, but you're still not confident and you're saying, you know, man, I have the rotation on Eau Rouge and Blanchiment, but this Pouhon and other corners, I just have too much oversteer. The front is really dominant every time. Then I suggest you do the next. You try to increase the front packers and a extra click or two of spring rate. This makes sure the aero box is not moving forward that easily, and it creates more of an understeer of the front tires in combination with the brake bias. Now, if you think to yourself, bro, this is too much work, I cannot understand it, check out my Patreon. I already created this pack also for the BMW and the McLaren. The BMW I just finished, and over here we have 5 different levels for high downforce, low downforce, mid downforce, and all the additional content about how to make small tweaks. So think about these levels as having a really good baseline with all the balance changes already made up, also with damper settings and all that stuff. And yeah, with a special solver and a track choice PDF. Check it out if you're interested in that. And that link will be in the description. I will also update this. So whenever this game gets like updates for tire model, suspension model, I will update this for free, because I don't believe in rebuying stuff every time an update comes, right? So let's move on. Now you can also have the issue of having just understeer on the Pouhon. And this is a great situation, because now let's say you had this brake bias and you have understeer on the Pouhon. So you're attacking Pouhon, you're braking, but you just cannot cope the corner and you understeer. This is how that looks like. So now an understeer example on the Pouhon. I'm braking, trail braking, but I cannot make the corner. The car wants to go in the straight line. The front right tire is heating up, meaning it's just so much understeer. So again, then you need to lower the brake bias. Over here as well, I'm braking, but I don't get rotation. The car just wants to be pulled straight. And this is a great example when we have too high of a brake bias. Okay, so the first step was figure out the low wing, set the rear ride height, change anti-roll bar, spring rates, packers on the second step to create proper rotation in these 2 corner sections. Now we're going to increase the pace, because how can we make a car that is fast? Probably in your setup you got the right behavior on Eau Rouge and the Pouhon, but you just want to now squeeze out the most potential lap time of your car. And these are these sections we need to focus on, and I will explain again with the model how you can think about this. I've been talking a lot with a beta tester, esports driver behind the scenes about what's actually quick and what's working in Le Mans Ultimate. And he said to me, if you really want to squeeze out the most pace out of a car, you should not rely too much on packers. So we need to remove the packers. But what does this mean? And if we have like a packer distance overall, and no packer distance. So if we remove every packer and we try to set up the car with anti-roll bar and springs, and we are increasing the packers. It's very simple, to be honest. If you use more packers, you create a safer car that will be a little bit hurting on the lap time. And if you just remove all packers, you create a faster car. But it's also harder to drive. Why? Because we have more aerodynamic changes with low packer distance. This complements also mechanical grip. So let's talk about that. In this example, I will show you an elevation change situation with a car setup. So if you're thinking about elevation changes, we're thinking about the 3 corner sections in the third step, which are kind of, you have an elevation change, you have a slow corner situation. So how do we increase the pace there? Because a slow corner, being a little bit faster in a slow corner, really affects your lap time, because you're there for a longer period. A slow corner, you're there for a longer period. So you want to think about this in the next way. So let's say you have an elevation change on track, and you'll have a situation where your left front is being on this moment of like an elevation change in the right front. If you have low packers, take note, if you have low packers, high anti-roll bar settings, and high spring settings, you create a situation that your car is just stiffer. So you're actually like more like a go-kart, and this creates, in the slow corner situation, a situation where you have overload on these tires, and these tires now take up all the pressure from the elevation change, and the other tires, like this red patch, represents a higher road elevation, yeah? And these blue tires are actually losing contact. So when you're hitting the brakes in this slow corner situation, this tire is overloaded and creates understeer, and this tire doesn't have any, or has less grip. This is very tiny, yeah, but it is very noticeable. If you have lower anti-roll bar settings, lower spring settings, less packer distance, so more suspension travel, and you're approaching the same situations like the bust up chicane, then you might have a situation where this tire does not have the burden to pick up all the weight from the car, and this tire, because we have more suspension travel, the wheels are more aligned with the tarmac and have more tire contact, we actually have more grip, right? But there's a catch here, and this setup with lower packers and like a soft setup is harder to drive because the aerodynamic shifts are more noticeable. So corners like Puhan and Arouge get a lot harder. Let's go into the setup screen and show you what I mean, like the difference between a level 3 and a level 5 setup on the BMW. Let me explain the changes between a level 3 and a level 5 setup. So a level 5 setup, I can really get into some juicy lap times. So let's just talk about it. So what I did, compare the level 3 with a level 5 setup. I like this feature, yeah, the comparison about the different setups. So what this means is that I created a softer anti-roll bar. I created a softer front anti-roll bar. I created a softer rear anti-roll bar. When I go to suspension, I have a softer front spring rate and a softer rear spring rate. Also, I am not using any packers. Now, I'm also not using this in level 3, but different cars really need some packers for some safety, especially on the front, but also on the rear to create rotation on throttle. Again, packers, you don't want to rely on them if you're really going for this super fast lap times, but packers are great safety net if you're like an intermediate or a beginner driver. Also, this faster setup has lower brake bias, it's more rotating, you need a lot more sense to drive this. Yeah, I really felt these kind of changes really help me in these slow corners because I just have more mechanical grip, but I'm trading it off for some safety in the fast corners, which we did in the first and the second step. In the description, there's the high wing setup, how I make a high wing setup, and you can add this video to that one as well. And in the pinned comment, there will be the file that I'm using this for. And what this basically means, I testing out these cars with a high wing, what was my top speed, what was my low wing top speed, and what was my lap time. And it's really important to see the difference in the second sector on Spa to figure out how much faster a low wing setup actually is compared to a high wing, and then you take an average from that and you create a mid wing setup. This way you can really measure how fast a car is on the straight and where it starts to hurt. Now, let me know what you think about this system, because I really feel this is a very systemized way to build car setups. These setups I just carry over into every other track and I just start solving them a little bit by bit. Now, if you did hit that like button, thanks for that. Let's say if we get this video up to, I don't know, 300 likes, we can make a video about adjusting this setup to all these different tracks, do some test laps. So, and also let me know in the comments, guys, what do you think of this approach? Thanks for watching. Oh, and by the way, if you really want to get into mechanical grip and you're like, bro, I really want to understand mechanical grip, I highly recommend to watch this video, because that's really deep dive about mechanical grip and how you can use it to tweak your setups. Thanks for watching.